The morning started quietly at Kensington Palace. The sky outside was a soft gray, and a light breeze moved through the tall trees in the palace garden. Inside, the halls were calm, almost too calm for a place that usually hummed with activity. Staff moved carefully through the corridors, speaking in low voices. Everyone could feel that something significant was happening that day, something that went beyond protocol and duty. Prince William was already awake before dawn. He stood by the tall window in his private study, a cup of tea growing cold in his hand, his eyes fixed on the garden below. He had not slept well. The weight of the coming hours pressed on him in a way he had not expected. He was a man trained from childhood to carry responsibility with grace, to show composure when others crumbled. But this morning, composure felt like a very heavy coat to wear. Catherine, Princess of Wales, came to find him there. She wore a simple robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she carried no air of performance or formality. She was just Kate, the woman who had stood beside him through more storms than the public would ever fully know. She placed her hand on his arm without saying a word. That quiet gesture said everything. He turned to look at her, and for a moment, the palace and its weight seemed to disappear entirely. The day ahead had been planned carefully. After months of Catherine's private health journey, one that had been spoken about only in careful, measured words to the public, there was a farewell of sorts coming. Not a final goodbye, but a deeply emotional one. A gathering that had been quietly arranged, involving people who had meant something real to William and Kate over the years. Old friends. Loyal staff. Ordinary people who had touched their lives in extraordinary ways. The preparation had taken weeks. Kate had been personally involved in every detail, even during moments when her energy was limited. She had written notes by hand. She had chosen flowers that carried meaning. She had asked for music that reminded her of happier and simpler times. Those who helped arrange everything said later that they had never seen such personal care put into any royal event. It was not a formal occasion dressed as something warm. It was genuinely, deeply personal. Their 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, had been told something simple and age-appropriate about the day. George, the eldest, understood more than his parents sometimes let on. He had been quieter than usual at breakfast, eating slowly, watching his mother with careful eyes. Charlotte had held her mother's hand tightly before being taken to school. Little Louis, ever the bright spark, had made everyone laugh with an innocent comment that cut straight through the morning's heaviness. Kate had laughed, a real, full laugh, and for a moment, the room felt lighter than it had in weeks. By mid-morning, William had put on his public face. Not the mask of a distant royal, but the face of a man who had decided to be present, to honor this day fully, rather than let it pass in a blur of emotion. He had spoken with his private secretary earlier, confirming the final arrangements. He had also made a quiet, private phone call to someone who had known both him and Kate for many years. That lasted only a few minutes, but left him visibly moved. Kate, meanwhile, had spent time alone in her private sitting room. A small desk near the window held a pile of envelopes, each sealed and addressed in her own handwriting. They were letters, personal letters to people she wanted to thank. Some were 2 longtime members of staff, some were 2 individuals she had met through her charitable work. People who had shared their own stories of struggle and survival with her, not knowing at the time how deeply those stories would resonate in the years ahead. Outside the palace walls, the world had no idea what was unfolding. The public knew only what had been carefully and respectfully shared. That Catherine had faced a serious health challenge and was focused on recovery. The nation had responded with an outpouring of love that had genuinely surprised both William and Kate. Letters, flowers, drawings from school children, messages from strangers across the world. Kate had read many of them herself, quietly in the evenings. She had cried over some. She had smiled at others. She had kept a small collection in a box on her bedside table. As midday approached, the first guests began to arrive at a private entrance of the palace. They came without fanfare, without cameras, without the usual trappings of royal ceremony. A woman who had worked in the palace kitchens for over 20 years, a charity founder Kate had supported for a decade, a nurse who had cared for Catherine during the hardest weeks of her treatment, a childhood friend of William's who had remained loyal through every season of his life. Each person was greeted personally, not by an aide or a member of staff reading from a list, but by William himself, who stood near the entrance, shook hands, embraced where it was right to embrace, said each person's name with genuine warmth. Several of those who arrived that day said later that they had not expected that. They had expected formality dressed as kindness. Instead, they found a man who was simply honestly glad they had come. Kate appeared a little later. She walked slowly but steadily, dressed in soft, warm colors, her face calm and quietly radiant. When the room saw her, a hush fell, not out of protocol, but out of something that had no formal name. It was the kind of quiet that happens when people are in the presence of something real. Something that moves past all the noise of titles and headlines and reaches directly into the human heart. She smiled. Kate. And the room smiled back. And somewhere in that simple exchange, millions of miles away from cameras and commentary, the day began in earnest. The private room where everyone gathered was not one of the grand staterooms of Kensington Palace. It was a smaller, warmer space, one that Kate had chosen herself, specifically because it did not feel like a palace room. There were no towering portraits of monarchs on the walls. Instead, framed photographs sat on side tables and mantelpieces. Family moments, candid images of laughing children and windswept beaches. A photo of William and Kate from years ago, taken by a friend rather than an official photographer, showing the two of them mid-laugh at something no one else could see. It was a room that looked lived in, loved in. Long tables had been arranged along one wall, covered in food and flowers. Nothing extravagant. Good food, simply prepared. Seasonal blooms in soft colors. Kate had specifically requested that nothing look overarranged. She wanted it to feel like a gathering between people who cared about each other, because that was exactly what it was. People moved slowly through the room, finding each other, finding familiar faces in unexpected places. The woman from the palace kitchens found herself standing beside a young nurse from the oncology ward, where Kate had received part of her treatment. Two people from entirely different worlds, connected by their care for the same woman. They began to speak quietly at first, then with growing ease. That kind of connection was happening all across the room. People who would never have crossed paths outside these walls were finding themselves in genuine conversation. Linked by a single thread, their relationship with William and Kate. William moved through the gathering with a deliberate calmness. He stopped at each small group, listened more than he spoke, and asked questions that showed he remembered details. He remembered the name of someone's grandchild. He asked about a health scare that one of the staff members had mentioned months earlier. He recalled the exact project that a charity worker had been fighting for and asked how it was going. It was not the behavior of a man performing warmth. It was the behavior of a man who had, somewhere along the way, made a genuine choice to pay attention to the people in his life. Kate spent much of the early part of the gathering seated, which those who knew her well understood without comment. She drew people to her rather than moving constantly through the room. Each person who came to sit beside her left the conversation looking quietly moved. She had a way of making people feel heard that had nothing to do with rank or title. She asked real questions. She listened with her whole self. She remembered things that people had told her in passing, sometimes years before, and she brought them up again naturally, as if those small details had stayed with her because they mattered to her at one point. A young woman who had first met Kate through a mental health initiative sat beside her, and barely managed to hold herself together. Kate had personally supported the charity that had changed this young woman's life several years earlier. The two had met briefly at a public event. Quick handshake and a few words, the kind of encounter the young woman had not expected to be remembered. But Kate had remembered. She greeted her by name, asked about her work now, and listened as the young woman described how far she had come since the darkest point of her life. Kate held her hand as she spoke, and when the young woman finished, Kate said something quietly, directly, meant only for her. Whatever it was, it made the young woman close her eyes for a moment and take a slow, steadying breath before she smiled. These moments were not photographed. They were not captured in any official record. They existed only in the memory of the people present, and perhaps that made them more real, not less. William noticed from across the room when Kate began to look tired. It was subtle. Only someone who loved her and had watched her carefully through difficult months would have caught it. A slight stillness around her eyes. A moment where her shoulders dropped just slightly from their usual composed line. He did not rush to her. He did not make it obvious. But within a few minutes, he had quietly circled the room and arrived at her side. Sitting down beside her and joining her conversation naturally, as if he had simply wanted to come and be near her. He stayed close to her from that point on. Those watching noticed it, how he positioned himself slightly toward her without crowding her. How his hand occasionally found hers, or rested briefly on her back in a gesture. That was entirely private, despite being in a room full of people. It was the language of a long partnership spoken without words. Two people who had been through something enormous together. Still finding steadiness in each other's presence, as the afternoon wore on. One of the longtime palace staff members, a man, who had worked for the royal household for close to 30 years, stood to one side of the room and watched William, and Kate with an expression that was impossible to misread. He had seen many royal occasions in his years of service. He had stood in rooms where great ceremonies had unfolded and historic decisions had been made, but he said later, to those who asked, that this quiet afternoon in that small warm room had moved him more than almost anything he had witnessed in 3 decades. There was no speech from William or Kate at this point in the day, no formal address. The decision had been made to let the gathering breathe on its own for a while, before anything was said. Let people find each other. Let the room fill with its own warmth. Let the hours mean something before anyone tried to put meaning into words. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted to something golden and low. It came through the tall windows and fell across the room in long slanted bars, catching the faces of the people gathered there. Someone at the piano in the corner had begun to play softly, unhurriedly, a melody that several people in the room recognized, but couldn't quite name. The kind of tune that lives in the part of memory that holds childhood and home and things you love before you know how to say, why? Kate closed her eyes briefly when she heard it. William looked at her. And between them, in that quiet moment, something passed that needed no explanation at all. There came a moment in the afternoon when the room grew naturally quieter. Not because anyone had called for silence or signaled a change in the day, it just happened. The conversations wound down by themselves, glasses were set aside, and people turned, almost by instinct, toward where William and Kate were sitting. It was the kind of quiet that settles when a room senses that something important is about to be said. William stood first. He had thought about this moment for days. He had written notes, crossed them out, started again. He had considered what kind of man he wanted to be in front of these particular people. Not a prince delivering a polished address, but a husband and a person trying to find words for something that resisted being put into words. In the end, he had decided to say less than he had originally planned. Because the more he had written, the further he had moved from the truth of what he felt. He began by thanking everyone for coming. Simple words genuinely meant. He looked around the room as he said it, not the polished sweep of a practiced speaker, but the actual gaze of someone checking that each face was seen. Then he spoke about what the past months had been like. He did not use clinical language or press release phrases. He spoke plainly about fear, real, human fear, and about the moments when he had not known what was coming. He spoke about what it had meant to him to see how many people had quietly, consistently shown up for his family. Not in front of cameras, but in the early mornings and the long evenings. In the messages that arrived from strangers who had nothing to gain from sending them. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was earned rather than effortless. Those standing closest to him could see the effort it took. At one point, he paused. Just a beat. Just a breath. And that pause said more than any sentence could have. He was a man standing fully in a difficult moment and choosing not to step back from it. Then he turned to Kate. He did not have prepared words for this part. Whatever he said to her in that room came from somewhere that preparation cannot reach. He spoke about watching her, about the kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside, the quiet, daily, unglamorous kind, the kind that gets up and keeps going not because it is easy, but because the alternative is to stop. And stopping was never something she had been willing to do. He spoke about how she had continued to think of others, even in the middle of her own hardest weeks. How she had asked about people, written letters, remembered details, continued to show up for her children with as much warmth and presence as she could give. He said he was proud of her. He said it plainly, without decoration. 3 words that landed in the room with a weight that made several people reach quietly for composure they almost lost. Kate listened to him with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady, her expression soft. She did not look away. When he finished, she stood slowly, with the careful grace of someone who had learned over recent months not to take the act of standing entirely for granted, and she turned to face the room. She had also prepared things to say, but like William, she felt the distance between prepared words and the real moment, and she let most of the preparation go. What she kept was the core of what she had wanted to say. She thanked the people in the room, each group of them, speaking with a specificity that showed she had thought deeply about each person's role in her life. She thanked the nurses and medical staff with a directness that had nothing of ceremony in it. They had been with her in the moments, stripped of all royal context, when she was simply a person who needed care, and their kindness in those moments had been something she would carry with her always. She spoke about her children, not in the way that royal figures often speak, about their families, with warmth that is carefully managed, but with the unguarded honesty of a mother who had looked at her children and feared, even briefly, what the future might hold for them. She said that getting through the hardest weeks had been, in a large part, about them, about wanting to be there, about the simplest things, school runs, bedtime stories, a game of football in the garden, having become enormous and luminous in a way they had never quite been before. And then she spoke about William. She turned to him in the same way he had turned to her, and the room became so still that the sound of the piano, which had stopped sometime during his speech, seemed to still be faintly present in the air. She said that she had always known he was strong. She had always known, in the abstract way that we know things about people we love before those things are tested, that he would be steady in a crisis. But knowing something abstractly and living through its proof are entirely different experiences. She had seen him be strong in ways that asked everything of him. She had seen him hold their children with confidence when his own heart was uncertain. She had seen him smile in public and come home and sit with the silence of everything he was carrying. And she had never once felt alone in that silence. Not for a single day. The room was undone. Not loudly. There were no sobs, no breaking down. But across the gathering, people were blinking too much, looking at the ceiling, pressing fingers briefly to their lips. The nurse who had cared for Kate during treatment was standing near the wall with her arms folded and her jaw set against the tears she was refusing to let fall. The longtime staff member from earlier had stopped watching with an expression of composed observation. Now he simply stood with his head slightly bowed, as if in the presence of something sacred. William reached for Kate's hand. She gave it. They stood together in that room full of people who loved them, who had served them, who had been changed by knowing them. And for a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. The afternoon light came through the windows, low and gold, and fell across both of them, as if the day itself was paying attention. Outside in the world, none of this was known yet. But inside that room, something had happened that would not be forgotten by any person present for as long as they lived. After the speeches, the gathering shifted. The formality, what little there had been, dissolved entirely. The room became something closer to what Kate had always intended it to be. People moved freely. The food was returned to. Voices rose again to a comfortable level. Children from a few of the families present, who had been waiting patiently in an adjoining room with a minder, were brought in and immediately changed the atmosphere. In the way that children always do, making everything simultaneously, louder and lighter. William crouched down to speak. Two small children who had arrived clinging to their grandmother's coat. He was at their eye level within seconds, completely unself-conscious about it. asking their names and telling them with great seriousness that the biscuits on the table near the window were, in his expert opinion, the best ones in the room. The children looked at each other, then back at him, and then charged toward the biscuits with complete conviction. Their grandmother laughed, covering her mouth with her hand. And William stood back up smiling. Kate had moved to a corner of the room, where she sat with the nurse, the one who had cared for her most closely during treatment. They were deep in conversation, leaning slightly toward each other in the way that people do when they want to be heard without being overheard. What passed between them was entirely private, but when they eventually embraced, before the nurse moved away to speak with others, both women held the embrace a beat longer than a formal farewell requires. The nurse walked away with her head down for a moment, gathering herself, before lifting her face and rejoining the room, one by one, throughout that late afternoon. The smaller moments accumulated into something larger than any single gesture. A palace kitchen worker who had baked Kate's favorite lemon cake for the gathering was quietly told afterward that Kate had specifically asked for a piece to be wrapped and set aside, to be sent to a ward at the hospital where she had received treatment. For the staff on night duty who wouldn't have been able to come, the kitchen worker later described the feeling when she heard that as something she could not quite explain. Just a kind of full, aching feeling in the chest that she didn't entirely want to go away. William found a quiet 10 minutes with his oldest friend, the one who had driven to the palace several weeks earlier for that brief phone call. They stood near the far wall with drinks in hand, talking in low voices, occasionally laughing at something remembered from long ago. Whatever burdens William had been carrying were not solved by those 10 minutes, but they were shared, and sharing them made the weight fractionally more bearable. His friend slapped him once on the shoulder in the uncomplicated way of old friendship, said something that made William look at the floor and nod. And then the conversation moved on. As the gathering began to wind down, people starting to say their goodbyes, collecting coats and children. Thanking staff near the door, William and Kate stood together near the center of the room and received each farewell personally. It was not organized as a formal receiving line. It simply became one naturally, because each person who was leaving wanted to say something directly to both of them. Before going, some of those farewells were brief and warm. A handshake, a few genuine words, a shared smile. Others were longer. The charity founder, who had worked alongside Kate for a decade, held both her hands for a long moment and said something that Kate answered with a small, private nod. One of the older members of staff, a man who had served the household since before George was born, reached the front of the informal line and lost his composure entirely when he tried to speak. He managed a few words, something about it being an honor, something about wishing them well, before his voice gave out. William put his hand on the old man's arm and said something quiet and kind. The old man straightened up, pressed his lips together in a tight, grateful line, and walked away with his dignity intact. It was the young woman from the mental health initiative who stopped the room one final time, though she had not intended to. She had been near the back of the informal line, waiting quietly. When she finally reached William and Kate, she had something in her hand, a small card, handwritten. She offered it to Kate almost shyly, explaining that she had wanted to put something on paper but hadn't known what, and that she had written and thrown away. Several versions before arriving at the few words on the card, Kate took it and read it then and there, which the young woman had not quite expected. She watched Kate's eyes move over the words, watched her face go through something quiet and complicated. Kate folded the card carefully and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she reached forward and pulled the young woman into a hug, that the young woman later described as the most honest thing she had experienced in years. Not careful, not ceremonial. Just real. William thanked her too, and as the young woman finally turned to go, he walked her the few steps to the door himself. At the threshold, she turned back once to look at them both. They were standing together, side by side, watching her leave with expressions that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She described it later as the look of two people who had been through something immense together and had arrived. Not at the end, but at a different kind of beginning. The last guest left as the light outside finally faded from gold to gray to the soft blue of early evening. The palace staff began the quiet work of clearing, moving through the room with practiced efficiency, folding tablecloths and collecting glasses and restoring order. William and Kate remained in the room a little longer. They were not talking. They were simply there, together, in the space that had held so much that day. A member of staff turned off half the lights and hesitated at the switch before leaving the couple alone in the warm half-dark. Neither William nor Kate asked for anything. Neither of them moved to leave. They just stood in the quiet of the day they had made, surrounded by the faint traces of its flowers and its music and its love, and let themselves feel the full weight and the full grace of everything that had happened. The days that followed were quieter than the day itself, but they were not empty. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way that certain days shift things permanently. The way a room looks different after you have truly cleaned it, as though you are seeing the same walls with entirely new eyes. William noticed it first in himself. He woke the morning after the gathering with something in his chest that was not the familiar tightness of the past months. It was not relief. Relief was too simple a word. It was more like the feeling of having honored something properly, of having given a day the weight it deserved, and not let it slip past in the blur of responsibility and management that so many difficult things get swallowed by. He lay in the early quiet and felt that, and let it be enough. Kate woke later than usual. She had slept more deeply than she had in weeks, and when she opened her eyes, the thing she did was reach for the small folded card that the young woman from the mental health initiative had given her. She had placed it on the bedside table before sleeping, beside the collection of letters she kept there. She read it again in the morning light, smiled at something in it, and set it down carefully among the others. Over the following days, news of the gathering spread slowly through the network of people who had been there, not as a story to be told publicly, but as something passed carefully between those who had experienced it and the people closest to them. A nurse told her husband about it over dinner and found herself stopping twice mid-sentence because she couldn't push the words through properly. The palace kitchen worker called her sister the evening after and talked for over an hour. The young woman from the mental health initiative sat with a close friend in her small flat and described everything she could remember, and her friend listened without interrupting. And when she finished, her friend said quietly that it sounded like the realest thing she had ever heard. In none of these tellings was there exaggeration or performance. The people who had been in that room had been given something genuine, and they spoke about it genuinely. There was no impulse to dress it up. The truth of the day was already full enough. For William and Kate, life resumed its shape carefully at a sustainable pace. There were school runs and quiet evenings, the children's noise filling the halls of the palace in the way that children's noise does, turning any grand space into something immediate and human. George had a football match that William attended, standing on the sideline in a jacket with his hands in his pockets, shouting encouragement along with every other parent there. Charlotte showed Kate a drawing she had made at school and explained it with tremendous seriousness. And Kate sat on the edge of Charlotte's bed and asked questions about every detail of it, because Charlotte expected nothing less. Louis did something that made everyone laugh before breakfast, and for a few minutes the kitchen was full of the best kind of noise. Kate continued her recovery with the same quiet determination she had brought to every other phase of it. She was not in a rush. She had learned, in the long months behind her, that rushing is often just another word for fear. Fear that if you slow down, the difficult thing will catch you. She had sat still long enough to know that it would not. She moved at the pace her body asked of her, and she found that pace was not as slow as it once felt. About a week after the gathering, a small piece of news reached William through an aide. The young nurse who had attended, the one who worked night shifts on the oncology ward, had received, through the hospital's official channels, a formal acknowledgement and personal note of thanks. The note had been arranged quietly, through a private route, by Kate herself. It cited the nurse by name, and described in specific and personal terms the impact of her care. The nurse had apparently stood in the nurse's station reading it while her colleagues pretended not to notice and failed entirely. William read the message about this, set his phone down on the desk, and looked out of the window for a moment. Then he picked the phone back up and sent a single line to the aide who had told him. He said, "That is exactly who she is. The letters that Kate had written before the gathering began arriving at their recipients over the following days. Having been posted through private arrangements, some of the recipients contacted the palace to acknowledge them carefully, respectfully, not wanting to intrude. Others simply kept the letters and said nothing, which Kate would have understood entirely. One letter reached a woman in the north of England who had shared her own cancer experience with Kate through a charity connection several years earlier. Never expecting to be remembered, the woman sat at her kitchen table and read the letter 3 times, and then called her daughter, who drove over that same evening to see it with her own eyes. None of this was ever meant to be public. None of it was done for any reason that had anything to do with image or legacy or the machinery of public life. It was done because Kate was a person who believed in a way that did not waver even in the hardest seasons. The people deserved to know they had mattered, that a small act of care, noticed and named, could change the way a person felt about the life they were living. And in the weeks that followed the gathering, as the world continued at its usual speed, the people who had been in that room carried something different with them. Something they could not always name, but could always feel. The sense of having been genuinely seen. The reminder that even in lives shaped by duty and distance and the weight of public expectation, there are still rooms where none of that applies. Where 2 people stand before those they love and speak the truth, simply and fully and without protection. Where a man turns to the woman beside him and says 3 plain words, "I am proud," and means them with every part of himself. Where a woman takes his hand in front of everyone and the whole room understands, without needing to be told, that they are witnessing something real in a world that moves too fast and forgets to isolate. The people in that room did not forget. They drove home through the evening streets carrying what had happened quietly inside them. Like something warm and lit, and the light of it did not go out. It had been a goodbye of sorts. But it had also been, in all the truest ways, a continuing.